The irony of the Times argument is that the emergency docket volume has been caused by the very leftist judges that they themselves hail as a vital check on presidential power. The left creates the emergency by issuing unconstitutional nationwide injunctions, and then they blame the Supreme Court for reacting to the emergency. So you can see that the Times built an argument, or you might say a house, if you would, not on a foundation, but on bare ground. Well, welcome back, folks, to Jack's Corner, where truth and reality has a seat at the table. We have a lot of major headlines to get through today, so let's get started and let's dive right in. The criminality of the Democrat left has been caught and revealed. We are now beginning to see why Trump was so hated and so much by the left. With the disclosure and declassification of the information from the Department of National Intelligence, clear patterns of criminal and unconstitutional coordination by the Democrat left have been disclosed. Starting with Obama and concluding with Biden, the fact patterns of coordination to take Trump down and the criminality in their treasonous conduct have been exposed. They knew it would be game over if Trump were to take office again, just as the communist-influenced Democrat Party was getting ready to put the last nail in the coffin of freedom and our Constitution. Trump messed it all up for them. Now we see the root and the reason for all the hatred of the man. It was a cover-up of their criminal activity. The coordinated takeover of America by radical left and their criminal activity is going to require a lot of alligator Alcatrazes in almost every state. If justice is done, you will see inmates from the media, education, government, and the judiciary. We are by no means out of the woods, and that is why every resource and pressure needs to come to bear for full disclosure to the American people. Once and for all, we need to define in the American minds the wickedness and the evil that resides in the Democrat left. It is truly the incarnation of evil and the source of all the misery, oppression, and poverty that they have brought us. At this point in our history, there is no room for compassion for those who have done such wicked things to destroy this country. As God told Lot and his family when they left Sodom and Gomorrah, and as he was destroying those cities, he told them, do not even turn around and look back. That is what freedom lovers must do now. They must set their faces like flint on the goal of restoration and jail the criminals, lest we, like Lot's wife, turn into a pillar of salt. Now, moving on to some national headlines, let's talk about the danger of experts and the wealth tariffs bring. We have breaking news this past week about the trade deal that Trump secured between the United States and the European Union. Once again, Trump is right, and the experts are wrong. You know, Thomas Sowell wrote extensively on the dangers and flaws of so-called experts, because what they do know is narrow. But they tend to think that being an expert in one area makes them an expert in all areas. We know this not to be true, and such is the case in the situation with the tariffs. Once again, the experts were dangerously wrong, or maybe they are just pathological ideologues and not experts at all. What I want you to realize is that Trump's tariff strategy is the reason why the United States just landed an amazing trade deal with the European Union. Since the introduction of these tariffs, there is so much money coming into the country that Trump is even considering rebates to Americans. The leaders in Europe have been milking us for billions ever since World War II. While that was important at the time to allow Europe to rebuild after the war, that policy should have been ended decades ago. But we had politicians who were not paying attention, and as a result, Americans hemorrhaged their wealth to countries in Europe who now have some of the strongest economies in the world. President Trump observed this years ago and complained on record about it. Now he has the power to do something about it, and that's exactly what we saw materializing this past week. Not only do we have billions of dollars coming into the country from the tariffs, but foreign countries are seeing the United States as a safe haven for investments. American workers are now going back to work, and we are going to start manufacturing what we need here as opposed to relying on our enemies to provide our rare earth minerals and pharmaceuticals. We finally have an adult and a pro-American in the White House who is finally protecting America and Americans. When you hear the Democrats complain, it's because they are more interested in their future than yours. Furthermore, they know that Trump's plans will work and are working. That is not good news for them. Think about it. How selfish is that of the Democrats? They were elected to protect you in what is in the best interest of the nation, not to protect their positions in power. Now I want to move on to another subject, and that's another news story that a lot of people are talking about, which concerns Republicans' massive win on Capitol Hill last week. And it is the end of taxpayer funding of leftist public broadcasting. Can you believe it? It took several generations to stop this. In case you missed it, Republicans have successfully removed federal funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. As part of a White House rescission bill, achieving a long-term conservative objective to defund public broadcasting entities like NPR and PBS, which are radically left-leaning and should not receive taxpayer monies for news and entertainment. This is significant and a long-awaited victory for conservatives who believe in limited government, oppose taxpayer subsidies for media, and see these outlets for what they are, centers of leftist indoctrination. But there's something I want to add to this. This is victory indeed, a long time in coming, but it glaringly proves the point that the left has made the American taxpayer pay for their indoctrination. And the left, as usual, is unapologetic. Several generations have been abused by this treasonous and hate America group. This is a big win, but now the question is it celebrating the extinguishment of a fire after the house was burned down? Let's hope not, and let's hope that it's not too little too late. Now I want to change gears a bit and focus on two big issues right now, both which have to do with the American legal system, and in particular the narrative Democrats are crafting about the judiciary as a check on President Trump. The first comes from an article in Reuters titled U.S. Judge Blocks Trump's Backed Medicaid Cuts to Planned Parenthood. The author, Andrew Chung, argues that the courts, and he means liberal judges, are the vital arbiters of executive powers and controversy. But I just want you to remember that this argument made by Democrats suddenly changes when a ruling is handed down by a conservative judge. The sad truth is that radical leftist appointees could care less about the Constitution. After all, they are Machiavellian. The means are justified by the ends. When you analyze the rulings of the leftist judges, they will always comport with their ideological backgrounds. The Constitution is the last thing on their mind. The left believes that their moral perspective is superior to all others, which I find kind of strange because they are not governed by any moral code, but rather one they made up from day to day. It's homegrown and not from any transcendent source. So the point here is that Democrats would have you think that the courts are a vital check on presidential powers, as in the case with the recent injunction on Trump's Medicaid cuts to Planned Parenthood. All is good and well with the court rulings, that is, until a conservative rules on something. You might think I'm speaking hyperbolically, and I wish, but I'm not, and you have to look no further than the New York Times to prove my point. On Monday, the editorial board for the Times published a piece titled "The Supreme Court Owes the Country Explanations for Its Big Decisions." The article argues that the Supreme Court is undermining its own legitimacy and the American legal system by frequently issuing major rulings through its emergency docket, often without public votes or clear explanations. The core argument of the editorial board is that the court's increasing use of this speed and silence approach, especially in favor of President Trump's policies, not only leaves the public and lower courts in confusion, but also fosters a dangerous perception of partisanship and constitutes an unchecked power grab by the judiciary itself. Well, what are we to think of this? First, far be it from me to even take the editorial board of the New York Times seriously, or anything more than just pure leftist shrill. They talk about the apparent excess of the Supreme Court's emergency docket. Of course, the Times cannot delve too deeply into that, because if they had, they would have to address the fact that there is a cabal of radical leftist federal district judges entering nationwide injunctions as if they were going to bypass the president and set themselves up as black-robed tyrants. The irony of the Times argument is that the emergency docket volume has been caused by the very leftist judges that they themselves hail as a vital check on presidential power. The left creates the emergency by issuing unconstitutional nationwide injunctions, and then they blame the Supreme Court for reacting to the emergency. So you can see that the Times built an argument, or you might say a house, if you would, not on a foundation, but on bare ground, which will not support their contentions. The Times draws the Supreme Court's quick decisions into question, as well as their legal reasoning. However, when you stop to think about the fact that once these matters come before the Supreme Court, they have already been briefed by the competing sides at the lower court level. The Supreme Court does not have to start from ground zero in emergency cases, but simply applies their expertise to the facts that have already been argued. It's not a situation where the Supreme Court is having to do the discovery all over, but simply review the matters already at hand. There is no reason why the decisions by the Supreme Court should not be quick and expedited. The law and facts are at their fingertips, but frankly, a lot of the Supreme Court decisions are way too delayed. And it's almost making the Supreme Court at times irrelevant. And in those situations, God forbid that they should be medical doctors, for the patient would be dead before they could ever get around to a decision. In conclusion, the Times editorial is typical leftist reaction, and it is not based on a sound legal theory or rationale. Now, keeping on with the news in the legal world, let's talk about someone whose name continues to pop up every week, and that is Kilmar Abrego Garcia. We are learning from various headlines, all reporting on the same story, that Garcia, the illegal immigrant that the Trump administration deported to El Salvador earlier this year, and his legal team are strategically attempting to keep Garcia in jail as a measure to circumvent his imminent redeportation by the Trump administration. The Democrats want to do this with the tens of millions they allowed into the country. And to what purpose? To increase their voter base. Here's how I want you to think about this story. It is an ethical given that attorneys are not only to do justice, but that they practice the facts given them and are not to make the facts up themselves. Yet so many attorneys today are too outcome-driven as opposed to simply doing justice in accordance with the facts. What are the facts in this case? Garcia broke the law when he entered the country illegally. Everything else is irrelevant and should be ruled by a court as out of order. It has always amazed me how lawyers today have lost the ability to be embarrassed. It reminds me of the old joke of the accountant, a physicist, and a lawyer in a room, and they were all asked the same question: what is 2 plus 2? Well, the accountant said 2 plus 2 is 4. And the physicist said, well, 2 plus 2 is 4.000. And when the attorney was asked, he ran over to the door and shut it, and then closed the blinds on the windows and asked, well, what do you want it to be? Now, the reason the joke is funny is because there is too much truth to it. And that is a shame. That's a shame of too many attorneys. And that just goes to exemplify how they're not sticking with the facts and just arguing the facts. They're making things up. Too many attorneys have found the left side of the political spectrum too lucrative, and too many are devoid of principle. And the bottom line of this story is that Garcia has broken the law. And given our immigration laws, he needs to be immediately deported. Now, to the next topic, and before we wrap up, I want to speak for a moment on something I call the psychology of protesters. Who has time, basically, for protesting? Seriously. Well, those who have nothing else to do, or the non-producers or anarchists who are being paid by rich globalists who have nothing else to do in their boredom. As I have been screaming out to the world for decades that liberalism is a mental illness, the studies and science is bearing out what I, with simple observation, was able to surmise. It was there for all to see, even without any elaborate studies or analysis. In an article in Psychology Today by John Johnson, he found that in the U.S., 32 of the last 34 largest single-day protests were promoted by liberal causes, or were promoting liberal causes, not conservative ones. The next thing he found was personality traits may make political liberal individuals more likely to engage in public protest. And the next observation he made was liberals have a greater tendency to challenge tradition and believe their actions make a difference. And in another article in Psychology Today by Dr. Robert Kramer, he concluded that indeed personality traits play a role in the left's conduct. I remember from biblical readings a truth that as a man thinks, so he becomes. That comes from Proverbs 23:7. And given the things the left does and supports, then it's easy to know the mind and what the liberal leftist thinks. As Dr. Kramer surmised, research shows that leftist authoritarians includes a desire to overturn systems and intolerance of other views. It also showed that leftist authoritarians to be characterized by mental inflexibility, prejudiced beliefs, and holding grievances. This is really a good, concise view of the left, but I would also include liberals too. He refers a lot to leftists, but I would include liberals too, as if there is really any much of a difference there. If you smoke weed enough, you end up doing the hard stuff. And being liberal long enough, you will end up becoming a left-wing radical, authoritarian, or a communist, to be concise. Weed and liberalism are the on-ramps to something worse. So Kramer goes on to say that left-wing authoritarians' attitudes are characterized by favoring punishment of those who dissent from group opinion, desiring to overturn existing hierarchies, expecting everyone to hold the same left-wing views, believing there is only one correct moral perspective, in focusing solely on one's own norms and boundaries, and needing rigid certainty. In other words, people high in leftist authoritarianism may struggle with skills like perspective taking, flexible thinking, and engaging with others of varying moral and personal belief systems. As I have said in previous articles and in my book, America's Systemic Psychosis, these mental conditions are taught and caught. It's not organic or just occurring randomly. No, it's inorganic and intentionally implemented by those who live in a godless futility and intolerant of any dissent or difference of opinion. In a finding of a study conducted of 74,000 people worldwide, it was concluded that the left holds prejudicial views of African Americans and Jewish people. Imagine that. Yes, this is the left's hypocrisy at its height. In psychological terms, they are the epitome of projectionists. That is, those who accuse you of what they are truly guilty of. They deflect from their own sin. Interestingly, the left are the first to convince you that everyone else is a racist but them. Most of you have been victimized by this, or at least intimidated into silence for fear of being called a racist by them. Not me. Didn't your mother ever tell you that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words shall never hurt you? Well, that's a cute way of telling you that freedom begins between your ears. Keep a strong border control around your mind and make sure that there is no room in there but for God and you, and in that order, and you will be immunized against the left. We have been given a reprieve with the election of Trump. Had that election outcome been different, it would have been lights out for America and an end to your freedoms, which were under full attack by those acting as president under the image of a mentally vacant Biden. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for now. This is Jack's Corner, and I'm Jack Richardson.